But next up, we have a full talk from Tyler Coleman, founder of Retora Games, developer of Merchant, Space Merchant, and Merchant Guilds, and a lecturer at University of Texas and University of California, and a founder of Ludo Systems, who is here to talk about the 80-20 rule, which you may have heard of, but is also extremely useful and applies to working with Proc-Gen. So next up, welcome Tyler.
Thanks, Alexi. So I'm here to talk about the 80-20 rule. I assume most of you have heard of this before, probably many different forms of it. But before we jump into it, I want to talk first about why this is on my mind, why it's a topic that I submitted a talk for and I've been thinking about for the past few years. And to do that, we're going to do a little bit of background history. So I launched my one game Merchant in 2014. It still gets updates once in a while. And a few years ago, we decided to try to make a multiplayer sequel, so online multiplayer game. I'm just going to share a couple seconds of a trailer just to illustrate if it plays, hopefully. Mostly just an excuse to share this awesome trailer. So this is the important part of the trailer. You'll see that this game is coming in 2021. So now I'm going to show you a second version of this trailer. So you'll see a very important part of this trailer, which says that the game is coming in 2024. So if you take away anything from me on this, it's don't put coming year on any trailer ever. But this is why I've been thinking about this 80-20 rule. We originally decided, hey, we're going to add a couple things to a game that already exists, add some multiplayer, it'll be out in a year. Then we realized how much more we needed to add to do that and make it good. So then we kept pushing it back. So no longer 2021. Maybe 2024, right? Who knows? We'll see. Actually, the good news is it is 2024. In fact, it's Wednesday. So just so you know, if anything about this talk seems rough around the edges, it's not because I've been playing Balatro on my phone. It's because I'm launching a game in 2 days. So with that said, let's jump into it. So I'm here to talk about the Pareto principle. Some of you have probably heard of it as this term, the 80-20 rule. They're kind of interchangeable. So the idea here, the original, is that 20% of the input creates 80% of the results. This has been applied in a lot of different ways. I like to just call it the 80-20 rule. I think it's more approachable that way. So like some of the versions that you maybe have seen before or people have talked about for this, 20% of the input creates 80 of the result. 80% of the land is owned by 20% of the population, the original form of this. 20% of customers make most of the revenue, 20% of workers produce most of the results. There's a lot of variations of this in software and production and business. But I'm here to tell you that these versions are boring, right? We're not actually here to talk about these. These are just big numbers that we don't care about. We're actually here to have some fun and think of some interesting 80-20 rules that may apply in games. So did you know that 20% of runs result in 80% of the victories? Or 20% of chests provide 80% of the loot? How about 80% of the damage reflected is from only 20% of the jam? 20% of champions are used in 80% of the matches. 80% of the map is from a small bit of Berlin, right? So there's a lot of versions of this. And of course, for any of these, it's important to know the most important statistic on the screen is that these are all made up on the spot. I'm not here to give you actual data. This is not peer-reviewed, studied. This is me just saying that, hey, things don't always happen in a linear manner. So what I'm actually here to tell you, it's not specific to numbers, right? It's not going to be 80-20 as exact numbers. I'm going to be rather apocryphal with that. You can use any version of this. I know a lot of people say 90-10, 88-12. You kind of make your own number that you think fits with you. Because this is not a numerology talk, right? I'm not here to tell you that everything is exactly 80-20 and that you should live your life by it. What I'm actually here to tell you is that, this is linear bad, curve good. So if we accept this premise, the reason I think this is important and a topic that is vital for games is we tend to think linearly. When we think doing things, when we think of the distribution of things, we think in a very linear manner. It's just the way our meat works, right? Something happens today, then tomorrow, then the day after. It's one day at a time, right? You do the tutorial, then you do level 1, then you do level 2. Just one more level, one more turn, right? Very specific, one at a time, one after the other. Movement, anything like this. We have these very specific analogies and concepts of doing things in a very linear pattern. But reality is more built on curves, right? A lot of data out there. Again, apocryphal here. I'm not saying all data. But reality really does work in a lot of curves. There's plenty of curves and non-uniform distributions in games, in life in general, in humanity. And so if we really want to represent reality, if we want to work within reality, I think it's important for us to understand how to work in curves and how to think in curves. So how do we adapt? How do we think in curves? Well, unfortunately, I don't have the perfect answer for you. I'm going to try to give you some ideas on how to think in curves. But going from just one day to then 2 days to then 4 days at a time, it's not a good of an expression. And that's just 1 week at a time, right? So it's not going to be easy. I don't think just saying think in curves, suddenly everyone thinks in curves. But I do think if anyone could do it, it's this group, right? We already think in big, interesting numbers. There's a way here for us as roguelike lovers to kind of adapt and to consider things and how things would work in curves. Also, Alexi, Scooby-Doo alignment chart for roguelikes. Just saying, next year, be a great talk. Okay, so where can we think in curves? This is going to be the majority of my talk. The idea of, hey, if things are in curves, where can we think about them in that way? What areas can we apply this to game development? So I'm going to cover 4 different areas. There's more than this. This is just all I have time for. The first one, of course, is just going to be the basic Pareto principle, the idea that 80% of the outcomes are from 20% of the causes. However, the easiest way to look at this one for games is to talk production and talk the actual process of outcomes, progress, from 20% of the causes time. So this is just the idea that 80% of the work is done in 20% of the time. So if you're most way there, it means you've probably only spent 20% of the time needed to have it be done, right? So the other 20% of the work takes another 80% of the time. So this version of the 80-20 rule, you most often see it as like, hey, I got something working, it took me a week to build a prototype. It's going to take another 4 weeks to get it done. How many of you have had this happen to you, right? And probably all hands go up. You get a functioning version of something, but to really get it done, it takes a few more weeks. But I'm here to tell you, we're not done yet. If we're not speaking in linear terms, then we also need to consider that taking 1 week and then 4 weeks is not actually done. Because when we're dealing with this approach, we're also dealing with something that's very recursive. So 5 weeks, it's done. Proud of you. You did a great job. The thing is, not really done, right? 20 more weeks now, it's actually really done. Good job, the feature's in, the level's done, you can move on. It's 25 weeks. Yeah, not bad. Thing is, 25 weeks to get it really done, it's not really done. So you still have to integrate it with everything else that's really done, bringing everything together, making sure it's a cohesive whole. So that 1 week, recursively, it's just going to keep getting bigger and bigger. So that 125 weeks, I'm so proud of you. You got everything together. You really had it feel like a cohesive whole. It's not really done though, is it? I mean, there's always more things. There's always things you can continue to work on. I'm not trying to scare you off of development by saying this. I'm not trying to say, everything takes forever and run away from game dev. But it is something that it's helpful to understand that like really actually being done with something does take a long time. And this one is the only one where I'd say these numbers are factually correct, 100% real, and no, I won't be taking any questions on it. So what can we do about this 80-20 time? This one's easy, right? Just always assume it'll take longer than you think. Take that number, multiply it by 4, then do it again, right? If you think something's going to take a month to be done, it's probably actually going to take 4 months. This is the bane of every game developer, but it is the honest truth of working in a creative medium like games. Next up, I want to talk about the innovation approach, the idea that a lot of people have coined, especially in creator spaces, inventions, and things like that. Products are 80% familiar, 20% unique. That all innovations, all creations building upon this familiar space, and it itself is just adding a small section of unique. I like to think of this one as this classic phrase, great artists borrow, great artists steal. What it's really saying is great artists steal 80%. So what is the 80%? What do you steal? So the 80%, when it comes to actually that 80% familiar, that's what I'd call the foundation. Right? This is the part of your project that is really just the structural integrity upon which you build everything else. In games, that can mean control interface, camera setup to your character, just kind of the tropes, the expectations, the inheritance of your genre. Right? This is the good part of tropes. This is the tropes that make the game more accessible. So these are the things that, okay, sure, it's a silly shtick, but it helps me understand your world. The framing is an important aspect, so it helps you build that sort of house upon the foundation. The part that makes your project unique is that other 20%, right? The thing that makes your game stand out is the 20% that you did different from every other game in your genre, every other project in your space. So again, 80-20, magic numbers, but what happens if you diverge from this, right? What if you say, I'm just going to make everything familiar, right? I'm going to do 100% familiarity. I'm going to do everything that's been done in that genre before. I'm going to follow along the path that's well tread. Well, when you do that, you tend to get a name, right? Clone, like. There's a lot of terms to describe games that are so similar to their predecessors. They're so familiar, they tend to get these labels. It's not always a bad thing. I'll say, like, as a professor, I sometimes recommend this to students. It's a great way to start out, kind of cut your teeth on development when you have that blueprint set in front of you. But of course, if you're doing it for financial reasons, then it's legally and ethically dicey. Accreditation, as we saw earlier with the Defense of the Ancients talk, it can be really challenging when you focus too much on that familiar. I always love the saying that, like, first game is innovative, second is a clone, third is a genre, right? At some point when enough games come out where they're really exploring the same familiarity space, you can start getting more granular about what makes each one unique, and then you start seeing genre appear. But what about the other direction? What if you avoid familiar? Say, I want nothing in common with the other genres, the other spaces. So certainly this exists in games and any creative medium, really kind of intentionally avoiding any sort of commonality to other products. Again, I think there's positives to this, but you're definitely making a very specific type of product. And whenever I think of this, I tend to go with film and think about this idea of like a filmmaker's film, right? These are films that are very interesting. They're definitely saying something. They're doing a lot of cool stuff, but they're just not broadly accessible, right? They didn't appeal to a large audience for whatever reason. I will also note on this one, I think it's an important distinction. What I'm going to call my tepid take is for creators like Kurosawa, they weren't necessarily niche or avant-garde, right? They did a great job at figuring out what was unique about them. Unfortunately, that language barrier and the inability to distribute into other areas made it so the language was part of their unique when it really shouldn't have been, right? The things that Kurosawa was doing were fantastic. They were broadly accessible. It was just hard for him to enter into other areas because of that. So, take that for what it will. I do think there are movies that are clearly built in this avant-garde, unique space, and others that just, were stopped for other reasons. So, we talk film here. Obviously, the next question is, what's a game maker's game? These are my own personal examples. And again, I'm not putting a value statement on this. I'm not saying these are lesser quality products. I would love to know if I get points to be the first person to reference Facade this year. Maybe not. But for any of these, there's a pattern of these creative products that they're usually called ahead of their time. They're praised for their exploration of the unique, but they just struggle with accessibility to a broad audience because they're doing too many interesting new things. They're exploring too much space at once. So this is also super subjective. This is a great opportunity in chat. Like, what is this game to you? What is the game that it almost intentionally avoids familiarity? It inspires others, but maybe it just didn't hit that audience in the same way. Another consideration in this space, familiarity, is theme. Some themes benefit from this more than others. In my own personal experience in game development, I've made a lot of games in the medieval fantasy space. And it's really easy to hit 80% familiar with medieval fantasy, right? We have these sort of tropes, we have these expectations where you can lean on them, right? Even when you add stuff that is not reality, like magic, there's kind of a rule set that's known and understood and trusted. On the flip side of that, though, it's really tricky to pull this off with sci-fi, something we realized when we made Space Merchant. What is your tachyon disruptor rifle? It's probably going to be different from any other game that has an item of the same name, right? I like calling these narrative greebles, right? Because you're adding tachyon disruptor to rifle. So you're trying your best to get some of that familiarity. Everyone knows what rifle is, but then you're putting your narrative greebling on it and kind of giving it this fun sci-fi spin. So you're doing your best to get some bit of familiarity into it. Another important concept of this, of the familiar and unique, is once you've made a game and you've sort of set that foundation where people understand it, you actually then are able to explore different sets of unique, right? Now you've created 100% familiar with a previous product. So now what is the 20% unique of your next product? What is your sequel's unique? And for this, I like to pick on The Sims. I think The Sims is a great example of this because of the decades of games and the long history of success that it's had. So what is the same across all Sims? What's different? So for the same, the easy and obvious here is the plumb bob, right? Very little has changed. Still a green shape, right? A little bit prettier shaders maybe, but generally speaking, it's still the same. That has become part of the familiar, consistent throughout every Sim. What about the location though, right? The map that you actually are on. This is something that they decided early on is not something that needs to be familiar, right? You don't need to reuse the neighborhood from one game to the other, because the neighborhood, even if it does have character, if there are certain street names in certain areas, that can be unique each game and still feel like a Sims game. So now you see something like Willow Creek is a completely different experience from the original Sims. What I'd love to know, maybe if anyone here worked on The Sims or knows people who did, is how much they knew what was going to be familiar. Because I think the most interesting use case here, and I referenced them earlier, is the Goths. These were characters that appeared in The Sims. They're very much built on a familiar, right? They are the Addams Family. They are the Munsters, right? They are built on this kind of familiar trope, but they were so successful in the first game, they were so iconic, that they've now become part of the familiar for all future Sims. Last thought on this with The Sims is just in general with Maxis. They do a great job of having these sort of what I like to call game dev calling cards. How many of you have seen reticulating splines, right? So this is one of many examples for Maxis, but they had these moments in their games that became part of their familiar, right? References to llamas and alpacas and these very specific things that were consistent across all of their games and became a sort of identifier of their familiar. So for this, I leave you the question, what is the 80-20 of roguelike? I'm totally jumping into, what our Berlin interpretation or what our interpretation is here, but what is that 80% that truly is the familiar for roguelike? And what is the 20% that is going to be the unique? You can probably find very consistently certain things stay as 80%. certain things are consistently part of the 20%, it's going to differ per game. But whenever you're creating a game, what you really have to ask is like, what is the 80% familiar of my genre, of my space that I'm going to build upon? Next up, I want to talk about the vocal minority. Now, I'm sure you all have heard this phrase. Normally it refers to an audience, the people within a community that are creating most of the conversation. But in this case, I actually want to talk about the vocal minority of content or of topic. So 20% of your content is 80% of your conversation. What parts of your game are people going to spend the most time talking about? What are the things that your Discords and your Reddits and your BBSs are going to be full of messages on? The big question to ask, of course, with this is which 20%, which part of my game, which pieces of my game are going to be the thing that everyone is talking about, good or bad, mind you. Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to this. There's no one answer that applies to every game. But I do have some thoughts on this particular flavor of 80-20 for games. First up, your foundation should be quiet. The silent majority of your content should be your foundation. Because usually if it's working, no one's talking about it. Even if you spent dozens of hours, dozens of months working on your character controller and your camera system to make sure that your character always is centered correctly and you figured out the right key mapping for everything for your game. If it is familiar, if it's part of kind of the norm, probably you're not going to see a lot of conversations about it. But that's a good thing, right? It means they're focusing on the unique. They're focusing on the things about your product that really make you stand out. If they aren't talking about this foundation, it's usually not positive, right? The reason I bring this up for this conference in particular is I'm really interested in thinking about what is that 20% of content in a roguelike or procedural generated game? What is everyone talking about? So it's a hard question to answer. It definitely differs per game. But first and foremost, the idea of the non-generative core, the piece of the game that is not generative, the things that kind of stay the same, something where if I play the game and you play the game, we have this common thread. We have things that happen that are very similar. For this section, the game I'd like to use as an example is Caves of Cut. So Caves of Cut, as I'm sure many of you know, does a wonderful mix of static content and generative content. So it is a perfect example of a game that potentially has content people could talk about that is generated versus content that is static. And a lot of them are a mix. So your spine fruit leads to spine fruit jam. It always leads to a specific type of damage resistance that will be variable or regenerative. You have things like certain characters that are always available, always potentially there for you based on the default starting conditions. So I asked Jason about this a few days ago, like, hey, what are your fans talking about? And he said, generally they see it as 50-50. Some people love talking about the characters and the things that are kind of knowns and really, showing love and care for certain NPCs that are static. But of course, the other side of it is talking about the generative systems and the things that they bring out. Which brings me to the artifacts. So for the most part, unless you're in a dev-facing event like this, most of your players, most of your audience are going to be talking about the artifact of the generative system, not the generative system itself. And just like anything else in this talk, they're probably talking about 20%. So for this, what we're really looking at is when you're generating systems, when you're generating maps, items, whatever it may be, some portion of it is going to be interesting enough that someone's going to decide to talk about it, to go on a Discord, to tweet, whatever it may be. And usually it's the thing that stands out, right? So to sort of steal the bowls of oatmeal, if you had 10,000 bowls of alphabet soup, the one that spells something is going to be the one that someone talks about, right? The one that does something unique and interesting that really stands out, the right combination of randoms, that's going to be the one that becomes part of that conversation. So as developers, it's really just important that we create systems that allow for that 20% of artifacts, those weird, unique, those outliers, to be possible. It should also be noted that the meta of your game is probably an 80-20. So what I mean by this is, your best items, your best character, your best combos. This one above and beyond beats everything else. It's really annoying when only 20% is in the meta or, somewhere in that range. But I'm here to say that that's fine and don't fight it, right? I don't want to say impossible, but it is definitely Sisyphean to try to expand that to a larger percent of your content. Certainly many games try it, your character battle games like League and Overwatch and things of that nature. Certainly they want all of their characters to be equally represented. But I think it's important to just have a meta that people can find because people enjoy the process of figuring that out. And then find ways to adapt it, right? For me, that's probably regular updates to the game, but that can also be game modes, special modifiers, making it so the meta is always changing for those who like to find this, but trying to balance it so it's a perfect spread, in my opinion, is not worth it. The other part is that the 20% here is subjective. I'm saying the 20% people talk about or are deeply interested in, that's going to differ per player. I've always loved the Magic the Gathering player profiles, and for this, it's like which 20% of cards speak to the Tammy, speak to the Spike, which cards, which areas are they going to be most into. All right, lastly, math. I'll get through this quickly. I think I got a few more minutes, and this is what you're all here for anyway. So 80% of the outcomes from 20% of the causes. When we're looking at this as an actual roguelike, when we're looking at actually generating content, this can mean a lot of things. This can be 80% of your damage comes from only 20% of your attacks. This is your crit, right? This is your power move, your special attack. This is breaking, damage, resistance, armor break. Having those special moments from a very specific subset of attacks. 80% of the rewards coming from 20% of your loot. This is that boss chest after defeating the boss in the region. This is that super secret hidden room that has a chest that opens and just drops 10,000 awesome items. And of course, for any of these, it's also recursive, right? What I said before, within that 80, within that 20 are additional 80s and 20s. I think TTRPGs do this wonderfully. D&D having a 1 and a 20, really saying these are special. We have set these aside to be special. Ensures that you have those moments for that sort of 80-20 rule to apply. I think when doing random in games, especially digital ones, it really helps to use a buddy system. Never roll alone. What I mean by that is just doing more than one random at a time, getting that weighted distribution. This ensures a more interesting random layout. For TTRPGs, maybe we could do 2d10, but I would say this is powered by the apocalypse, right? What I do in a lot of my games is I actually curve my randoms using easings. So I'm just doing a basic lerp, 0 to 1 random, and then I apply an easing to give me a different value rather than just having that kind of even distribution. Another place you can apply this, everybody knows this guy, everybody knows what he says. So this is a classic example of you have an opportunity here to give this person many different things to say, but if you weight your grammars, you can ensure that that really fun special one is only occurring, n amount of times. Lastly, just don't do random. For our games, we actually kind of borrowed this idea from Clash Royale that has this chest cycle. You can give the sense of random without actually having a random system to really ensure that that 80-20 is coming at a good cycle, that that rotation of good moments occurs at the intervals you want it to. And again, remember everything's recursive. So within that, there's a subset, there's a subset. So with this, I leave you my final thoughts. Is this dangerous? Am I introducing dark patterns? Maybe. I think not treating this like one more thing in your toolbox can be dangerous, right? This is just one more way to approach development. Don't confidently think you always know what the 80-20 is going to be. Maybe you think it's going to be this character, it ends up being something else. This is really just one more thing to discuss, one more way to plan, but throw out anything you get from it. And lastly, I leave you with this. I really said 80-20 is important, and everything is secretly 80-20. So I want to thank you for your time, and hope to have a great conversation.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And yeah, I love it. I have to say, to back up this talk on the development of Nightingale, for at least all the time I was there. The maxim was 80% generated, 20% handcrafted was our approach to procedural generation. And I also know, because I mentioned it in lectures, that in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, they had a generator for cutscenes, and it was 20% fully generated, just like use it as is, 80% required varying levels of hand touching. So,
Not a numerology talk.
yeah, but gotta say. Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I believe that now it is time for a numerology talk, I've heard. But so perfect lead up. Couldn't ask for a better transition. So thank you very much, Tyler.